One of the things you always look for every NFL season is you look at the team that lost the Super Bowl the previous year and you wonder if they're going to suffer from the Super Bowl hangover. And we know what that is, where the loser of the Super Bowl one year fails to make the playoffs the next year. And we see it happen time after time more often than not that this is the case. So looking at the Seattle Seahawks coming into this 2015 season, the fact that they were the Super Bowl champions of Super Bowl 48. And Super Bowl 49, they let a golden opportunity to go back-to-back slip through the grass, and especially in the way and the matter, in the fashion that it happened, you're wondering, could the Seahawks potentially implode a little bit? Could they be a bit of a disappointment? Could they fail to make the playoffs? Could it be time for some change in Seattle in terms of shaking up the roster a little bit? Well, there were stretches of this year where you looked at the Seahawks, especially early on in the year, and you're like, man, this team would be lucky to make the playoffs. They're not that good of a team. But they pulled it together the second half of the year. The defense started to play like the Legion of Boom. The offense had demonstrated more explosiveness than they ever have with Russell Wilson at quarterback. And this was a team that pulled it together and made a season out of it. They went 10-6. While they finished a couple games back of Arizona in the NFC West, they were good enough to get themselves into the playoffs. They had a wild card game in Minnesota in those frigid conditions, and no matter how it happens, by hook or by crook, they won the fucking game 10-9. And they moved on. They faced Carolina. Carolina steamrolled them in the first half. Seattle fought back like champions in the second half to at least make it a somewhat competitive game. So, it's like on the one hand, maybe the Seahawks organization is disappointed. Maybe they wish there would have been more, and they would have done more. But on the other hand, you look at it and you're like, this is probably about the best that they could do, frankly. And in some ways, you got to look at it as a bit of a positive based off of some of the things that happened throughout the course of the season, and to see where they started and how they started and where they ended up and how they ended up there. You do have to feel good about this team for 2016, at least a little bit. So what went well for them this past year? I think you got to look offensively. At the end of the day, statistically, this was a really, really good offense. You're talking about a team that finished fourth in the league in points scored, third in the league in rushing yards, which is particularly impressive considering they didn't have beast mode for most of the second half of the season, and he wasn't really much of a factor throughout the entirety of the 2015 season, if we're being so honest. A team that was fourth in the league in third down conversion percentage. So it's a team that was getting a lot of third and shorts, and when they were getting into those opportunities, they were converting at a much higher rate than most teams in the league. Second in the league in time of possession, so they were controlling the clock. They were imposing their tempo, their will on the game, limiting the amount of time their defense was on the field. So you're already taking a really, really good defense, an elite defense in the NFL, and giving them less time to have to work, so they're fresher, and you know how that goes. Defensively, another year where they finished first in the league in points allowed per game. They were first in the league against the run. Typical patterns for those great Seahawks defenses we've seen in recent years. They were second in the league against the pass, second in total yards allowed. Now, the passing numbers could be a little misleading just because of the fact they play teams like St. Louis and San Francisco twice a year. But at the end of the day, over the balance of a 16-game schedule, this defense ended up, when all was said and done, being elite once again. Offensively, as a team, they had 7 games where they scored 30-plus points. Russell Wilson had 4,600 combined yards, 35 total touchdowns, only 11 turnovers. If things would have shaken out a little different and Cam Newton wouldn't have went 15-1 with the Carolina Panthers, you might be looking at Russell Wilson as the MVP of the National Football League. And I don't think we talked about him enough when all was said and done about being an MVP candidate, because he was. He had a really good statistical season, and you could see his impact on the team, especially the second half of the season on the offensive side of the ball. And I think offensively, you got to look at Doug Baldwin, and you're talking about a guy that, things really came together for him, especially once Jimmy Graham went out of the lineup. He ended up with over 1,000 yards receiving, 14 touchdown catches. I believe that was a franchise record. I mean, that was a really good season for a guy that was once undrafted out of Stanford. Now in his 5th year in the league, here's a guy that's going for over 1,000 yards, has 14 touchdowns. I mean, incredible stuff. You look at Michael Bennett on the defensive side of the ball. Easily one of the 4 best defensive linemen in all of the National Football League, based off of what he can do, his responsibilities in that Seahawks system, how important he is to that defense. I mean, you'll talk about guys like J.J. Watt and Aaron Donald and Khalil Mack if you want to mention them in terms of defensive linemen with Mack especially. If you kick him out to linebacker, so be it. But Michael Bennett, man, he is a freaking stud. He is a beast. And again, I will emphasize, to me, one of the 4 best defensive linemen, regardless of position, in all of the National Football League, period. If you don't think so, I'd like to hear who you think would be the 4 that would be better than him. I don't know that you really say so. So, again, defensively, they were elite again when all was said and done. Offensively, they performed at an elite level, especially when it came down to putting points on the board. And Russell Wilson had an MVP caliber season. But what didn't go well for them? I think you got to start off with the Jimmy Graham trade. You weaken the interior of your offensive line by trading away Max Unger, who wasn't a stud, but he was very solid at center. Then you give away a first-round pick, which could have been used to help build up the interior of that offensive line or get another weapon on offense, or maybe improve some of the depth at the corner position in the secondary. And you give it up to Jimmy Graham, a guy who you bring in, and instead of trying to make the offense work with him and building it around him, you try to fit him a square peg into a round hole. You try to make him an inline blocking tight end. It was a mess. It was an absolute mess. And then, of course, just as it seems like you're starting to figure it out a little bit, and it seems like he's starting to get with the program and they're getting with the program with him, of course, he tears his patella tendon, and he's out the rest of the year. Now, some might say they were better off after he was out of the lineup, and there's a very strong argument to be made for that, and the reason being is, frankly, because they were. So it just makes that Jimmy Graham trade look even worse now that we're a year through it. The Cam Chancellor holdout to start off the year. They lost their first 2 games. Cam held out the first 2 games. He really didn't get what he was looking for. It hurt the team. That was just a disaster. And again, those first 2 games that they lost, could they have both been potentially victories? Maybe. Could one of them have been? Who knows? But it just, at the end of the day, that holdout didn't accomplish anything really for any parties involved. And what's really going to be frustrating if you're a Seahawks fan is how the hell does this team make the playoffs again, but they're losing twice to St. Louis? How in the fuck does that happen? The epitome of mediocrity. You're losing to the Rams twice. How could you let Jeff Fisher and his program get into your head like that? How do you let that sorry-ass team, frankly, especially on the offensive side of the ball, sounds Todd Gurley, and even Ted Gurley, fuck it doesn't matter. How do you lose to the Rams twice? Matchups shouldn't fucking matter. You got to beat them jokers at least once, if not twice. Marshawn Lynch going down with his injury. Again, it's one of these things where, you build so much of your offense around a guy like him and you don't have him. Now, Thomas Rawls came in when he was in the lineup and he made a good show of it, but then he got hurt towards the end of the year when they were really going to need him the most come playoff time. Marshawn Lynch may very well be done with the Seahawks. He may very well be done with the entire National Football League, and it's sad to see happen, but it's a reality. But the fact of the matter is they just didn't miss beast mode that much. But at the same point in time, you still end up missing him somehow because beast mode is beast mode, and they didn't have him, and that's a lot of salary cap space to be tied up into one guy that really, frankly, didn't give you a whole lot in 2015. So now we head to the offseason and we head to the NFL draft. Now, this is a team that's taking care of a lot of its young core players in recent years with long contract extensions. Richard Sherman, Earl Thomas, Cam Chancellor, Bobby Wagner, Michael Bennett, Russell Wilson. They've taken care of a lot of guys. But they're going to have to make decisions on guys like Bruce Irvin, who's probably going to be gone, Russell Okung, who is a solid but not spectacular left tackle, and he's a guy that himself has trouble staying healthy. How much can you really afford to pay in a solid but not spectacular left tackle who doesn't play 16 games a year? These are some of the tough decisions that a team with a lot of talent, a lot of big-name stars has to make at some point in time because you can only pay so many guys so much. And that's what makes the NFL draft so important for this team, especially now that they're at that top level, now that they are a consistent contender, they got to be able to maintain it. And frankly, if you're looking at the Seahawks, the recent draft history hasn't been that stellar. I don't think 2013 or 2014 really produced a lot that you can write home about. 2015 gave you guys, like you want to include Thomas Rawls as an undrafted free agent. That's one guy. Tyler Lockett, the third-round pick out of Kansas State. is definitely a keeper. Frank Clark, their second-round pick out of Michigan, showed some promise, showed some potential, but again, they used that first-round pick to get Jimmy Graham, and what did that really bring them? And you look, like I said, at 2013, 2014, not a lot of quality there, not a lot of impact there, and that could eventually catch up to this organization. So they need to go into this draft process, and they need to deliver, and they need to have a nice, solid draft. I think number one priority has got to be doing a better job of protecting Russell Wilson. I mean, what's incredible to me about Russell Wilson's performance is you don't have Jimmy Graham for a good portion of the season. Their offensive line was terrible, especially in pass protection, but yet he still found a way to have an MVP caliber season. A lot of other years, Russell Wilson is the National Football League's most valuable player. It just wasn't going to happen this year. You got to protect him better. You need to get better at offensive tackle. If you're in round one, you're looking at left tackle, you're looking at right tackle. It doesn't matter. If they play offensive tackle, you need to fucking draft them. Offensive guard is another possibility. Maybe you look in that direction in round number one. Maybe it's somebody like a Joshua Garnett from Stanford. Again, they need some help there, because as bad as their perimeter pass blocking has been at times, their interior pass blocking in particular has been worse, and that's been a huge problem. They don't have an adequate replacement on the roster, as I view it right now, to replace what they lost to Max Unger when they traded him away to the New Orleans Saints. This is a team that needs to invest multiple picks in this draft on the offensive line. Does it need to come all necessarily in the first 3 rounds of the draft? No, not necessarily. Do one of their first 2 picks need to be spent on the offensive side of the ball, on the trenches? Yes, it does. Some might say, well, losing Marshawn Lynch, maybe you address running back high. You could address running back at some point in time, but I don't know, based off of what the Seahawks expect their running backs to do and the style of runner that they like. I don't know that they have to invest a high pick on him. Especially, you would hope that Thomas Rawls will come back from his injury and he'll be given an opportunity. And he showed some flashes of potential that he could be a kind of featured back for them in their system and what they do. I think defensively they still have some needs. Obviously Bruce Irvin's shown the door. Do they really have an answer on the roster for him there? Some might say a Cassius Marsh. I'm not so sure about that. They could still use some depth at corner. Losing guys in free agency the past couple of years, guys like Brandon Browner, guys like Byron Maxwell. We could laugh because other teams are stupid enough to pay him big-time money. But the fact of the matter is in that number 2 corner role, they were very, very good for the Seattle Seahawks. And when you look at the number 2 corner that's there, and you sit there and you say, you can stay away from Sherman, and you can do some things against that defense at times. But ultimately, again, when all is said and done, they got to protect Russell Wilson better. Because otherwise, you keep up that crap, you're going to get your quarterback murdered. And that's all there is to it. And they just have to invest in that offensive line heavily. Multiple picks. I think if you're looking at the Seahawks draft, if at least 3 picks, maybe one in round 1, one on day 2, and another one on day 3, then it's a disappointment. Now, based off of the way the draft breaks down, with the Seahawks having the 26th pick in the first round, they could be, with a really good defensive line class this year, it could be looking at taking defensive line in round 1, in particular a defensive tackle, maybe a 1-gap penetrator, a 3-technique type of defensive tackle. And there's definitely a need for that on their roster. But I would say that with the talent at that position in this draft, they could maybe wait a little bit for it. But I wouldn't be surprised if they took a defensive tackle at pick number 26, maybe somebody like, a big nose tackle, even like an Austin Johnson from Penn State, who's more athletic than you think, would seem to actually be a really nice national fit for the Seahawks. But until they address that offensive line and they improve that offensive line and they improve the protection for Russell Wilson, they're going to be the team that they were this year, a team that at moments flashes Super Bowl potential and at other times flashes mediocrity, will probably sneak into the playoffs, maybe be lucky enough based off of championship medal and experience to win a playoff game. What we'll talk about them far more than we should as championship contenders.